It was an ordinary evening at Marcello's, a high-end Italian restaurant in the heart of Manhattan. The clinking of wine glasses and the murmur of quiet conversations created a refined atmosphere. The kind where even the smallest disruption would turn heads. Among the well-dressed patrons sat James Caldwell, a self-made millionaire in his mid-30s. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, he exuded an aura of success and detachment. His eyes skimmed a tablet screen displaying graphs and projections. Numbers were his world, a safe, predictable domain. As James reached for his wine glass, a voice broke through the hum of the restaurant. "Excuse me, sir." It was soft yet firm, a tone that didn't ask for attention but demanded it. James looked up, startled. Before him stood a young girl, no older than 10, her frame slight, her clothes plain and worn. Her oversized sweatshirt hung loosely over her small shoulders, and her sneakers were scuffed beyond repair. But what struck James wasn't her appearance, it was her eyes. They were large and solemn, carrying a weight far too heavy for someone her age. "I need your help," she said, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. James blinked, taken aback. He wasn't used to being interrupted, least of all by someone like her. He glanced around the room. The other diners had noticed the exchange. Their whispers and disapproving glances were impossible to ignore. "Do you know me?" he asked, his tone bordering on irritation. "No," she replied simply. "But you look like someone who can help." "My name is Ava." James leaned back, studying her as if she were a puzzle. "What kind of help are you looking for?" "Ava? It's my mom," she said, her small hands clenching at her sides. "She's sick. She can't get up, and I don't know what to do." James frowned. "Have you called an ambulance?" "They came," she said quickly, her voice breaking slightly. "But they said they couldn't do anything unless we had money." "We don't have money." The bluntness of her words hung in the air. James felt a pang of discomfort, but he wasn't sure if it was because of her story or the growing number of eyes on them. "Why did you come to me?" he asked finally. "Because no one else would listen," she said, her voice firm again. "I tried everyone. They were all too busy." "You don't look busy." James glanced at the tablet on the table and the untouched glass of wine. Busy wasn't the right word for what he was doing. He was occupied, or at least he thought he was. For a moment, he didn't respond. This wasn't his problem. He didn't know this girl, her mother, or anything about their situation. But those eyes, so filled with quiet desperation, made it impossible to dismiss her. "All right," he said, standing abruptly. "Show me where she is." Ava didn't smile or thank him. She simply nodded and turned toward the door, her small frame cutting through the sea of tables. James grabbed his coat and wallet, ignoring the whispers and raised eyebrows of the diners around him. As they stepped outside, the crisp night air hit them. James looked down at Ava, walking a step ahead of him with a determination that seemed too mature for her age. "How old are you?" he asked. 10, she replied without turning back. "And you're out here, alone, asking strangers for help?" he pressed. "I don't have a choice," she said, her voice carrying a hint of defiance. "She's all I've got." James didn't reply. Something about her words hit harder than he expected. They walked in silence for several blocks. The bustling streets of Manhattan grew quieter as they ventured into less affluent neighborhoods. The bright lights of the city dimmed, replaced by flickering street lights and shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. James felt out of place in his tailored suit, the polished shoes clicking against the uneven pavement. Finally, Ava stopped in front of a dilapidated apartment building. The facade was cracked, the windows dirty and patched with tape. She pushed open the heavy front door, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. "This way," she said, leading him up a narrow staircase that creaked under their weight. When they reached the top floor, Ava stopped in front of a door with peeling paint and a broken handle. She hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. James braced himself for what lay beyond. The smell hit him first, a pungent mix of dampness, mold, and something faintly sweet that turned his stomach. The apartment was barely furnished. A worn-out mattress lay in the center of the room, and on it was a woman, motionless. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. Ava knelt beside her mother, taking her hand gently. "Mom, I brought someone to help," she said softly, James stood frozen, unsure of what to do. He wasn't a doctor, and this was far beyond anything he'd ever dealt with. But the sight of Ava holding her mother's hand, her small frame trembling, spurred him into action. He pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. "We need an ambulance," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. He gave the address and hung up. Turning back to Ava, "They're on their way," he said, crouching down beside her. "You did the right thing." Ava nodded, but her eyes never left her mother's face. James noticed the exhaustion etched into her young features, the way her hands trembled as she clung to her mother's. Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air. Paramedics burst into the apartment, their efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos of the room. James stepped aside as they worked, his heart pounding in his chest. One of the paramedics turned to him. "Are you family?" "No," James replied immediately, but then he caught Ava's pleading gaze. "But I'll come with her." As they loaded Ava's mother onto the stretcher, James reached out a hand to Ava. "Come on," he said gently. "We're going with her." For the first time, Ava hesitated. Then she placed her small hand in his, and together they followed the paramedics into the night. The ambulance ride was a blur. Ava sat close to her mother, her small hand clutching the woman's limp fingers as if holding on could somehow tether her to life. James watched from across the cramped space, feeling entirely out of his depth. The paramedics worked with practiced urgency, attaching monitors and administering fluids, their faces a mask of calm professionalism. James envied their composure. When the ambulance pulled up to St. Vincent's Hospital, a group of doctors and nurses were already waiting at the emergency entrance. The stretcher was whisked away with swift precision, Ava jogging to keep up with her mother's side. James hesitated for a moment before following. This wasn't his world. Hospitals, emergencies, life or death decisions, but he couldn't leave now. Not after what he'd seen. A nurse stopped them just outside the double doors of the treatment area. "Only medical staff beyond this point," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "We'll let you know as soon as we can." Ava opened her mouth to protest but stopped herself. She looked up at James, her wide eyes shimmering with uncertainty. He placed a hand on her shoulder, unsure if the gesture would comfort her but needing to try. "Let's wait in the lobby," he said softly. Reluctantly, Ava nodded, allowing James to guide her to a cluster of plastic chairs in the waiting area. The hospital was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the sterile walls. James sat down beside Ava, who tucked her knees to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around them. For a while, neither of them spoke. James glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands crawling forward with agonizing slowness. He wanted to say something, anything, to fill the silence. But words felt inadequate. What could he possibly say to a 10-year-old who was on the verge of losing her world? "I didn't think you'd come," Ava said suddenly, breaking the stillness. Her voice was barely above a whisper, her gaze fixed on the floor. James turned to her, startled. "Why wouldn't I? People don't usually care," she replied, her tone matter of fact. "They see me and think I'm just a kid looking for trouble. They don't listen." James frowned, her words hitting harder than he expected. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "That's not fair to you." Ava shrugged, her expression unreadable. "It doesn't matter. I've learned not to expect much from people." James opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a doctor approached them. He was middle-aged, his face lined with the exhaustion of someone who had spent too many nights in places like this. "Are you family?" the doctor asked, looking between them. James hesitated, glancing at Ava. She straightened her back, her small frame brimming with a defiance that seemed to dare the doctor to dismiss her. "She's my mom," Ava said firmly. The doctor nodded, his expression softening. "We've stabilized her for now, but her condition is serious. She's suffering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, and an infection that's spread to her bloodstream. We're starting her on antibiotics, but she's very weak. The next 24 hours will be critical." Ava's face didn't change, but James noticed the way her hands clenched into fists. "Can I see her?" she asked. "Not yet," the doctor replied gently. "We need to monitor her closely for now, but I'll let you know as soon as she's stable enough for visitors." Eva nodded, her jaw tight. Thank you. The doctor left, and the silence returned, heavier than before. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He wanted to reassure Eva. But the truth was, he didn't know if everything would be alright. He hated feeling powerless. But this wasn't a problem he could solve with money or negotiation. This was real, raw, and messy. You hungry? He asked finally, his voice breaking through the tension. Eva shook her head, her arms still wrapped around her knees. I'm fine. James frowned. He'd heard that phrase before. From employees trying to downplay problems. From business partners hiding doubts. It was a shield, and Eva was wielding it with practiced skill. You should eat something, he said gently. It's been a long day. I said I'm fine. She snapped, her voice sharper than before. She immediately looked down, guilt flashing across her face. Sorry, I can't think about food right now. James nodded, deciding not to push. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, letting the silence settle again. He wasn't sure how long they sat there, but eventually, Eva's head drooped, her exhaustion catching up with her. She leaned against the armrest of her chair, her eyes fluttering closed. James watched her for a moment, then stood quietly. He crossed the room to the vending machine, fishing a few bills from his wallet. He returned with a bottle of water and a pack of crackers, placing them on the chair beside Eva. The hours dragged on, each one marked by the rhythmic ticking of the clock. Nurses and doctors moved through the halls with quiet efficiency, their footsteps echoing against the tiled floors. James fought the urge to check his phone, to distract himself with work. This wasn't the time for distractions. Finally, a nurse approached them. You can see her now, she said softly. Eva jolted awake at the sound of the nurse's voice. She blinked rapidly, disoriented, before scrambling to her feet. James followed as the nurse led them down a hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. When they entered the room, James felt a pang in his chest. Eva's mother lay on the hospital bed, her face pale and gaunt. The beeping of the monitors was the only sound in the room. Eva rushed to her side, her small hand reaching for her mother's. Mom, she whispered, her voice cracking. It's me, I'm here. Her mother stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at Eva, a faint smile tugging at her lips despite her obvious pain. Eva, she murmured, her voice barely audible. James hung back, giving them space. He watched as Eva leaned close, her small frame almost disappearing against the hospital bed. The raw emotion in the room was almost too much to bear. For the first time in years, James felt something shift within him. He had spent his life building walls, shielding himself from anything that could disrupt his carefully constructed world. But here, in this tiny hospital room, those walls began to crack. The ride back to Eva's apartment was heavy with silence. James had offered to take her home, and though Eva hesitated, she finally agreed. She spent the entire drive staring out the window, her face a mask of exhaustion. James glanced at her periodically, his mind spinning with questions he didn't know how to ask. When they arrived, Eva climbed out of the car without a word. The building loomed before them, even more run down under the pale light of the street lamp. James followed her inside, his footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. The apartment was just as grim as he remembered, dimly lit and sparsely furnished. A few dishes sat piled in the sink, and the air was thick with the stale smell of dampness. Eva set her small backpack on the floor and sat on the edge of the mattress in the middle of the room. She looked even smaller now, her shoulders slumped, her hands fidgeting in her lap. You shouldn't stay here, James said finally, breaking the silence. The words were out before he could think them through. Eva looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. Why not? It's my home. It's not safe, James replied, gesturing to the peeling walls and the cracked windows. And you shouldn't be here alone while your mom's in the hospital. Eva's jaw tightened, and for a moment, James thought she might argue. But then her gaze dropped to the floor. I don't have anywhere else to go. The words hit James harder than he expected. He shoved his hands into his pockets, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked in his tailored suit. You could come stay with me, just for now, until we figure something out. Eva's head snapped up, her expression a mix of surprise and suspicion. With you? Why would you do that? James hesitated. He didn't have a good answer, at least not one that would make sense to her. Because it's the right thing to do, he said finally. No one should be alone right now. Especially not you. She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for something she couldn't name. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained cautious. Okay, just for now. James exhaled, relieved. All right, pack what you need. Eva glanced around the room, her gaze lingering on a few small items, a worn stuffed animal on the mattress, a threadbare sweater draped over the back of a chair. She moved quickly, stuffing her belongings into the small backpack she had brought to the hospital. Within minutes, she was ready. The drive to James's penthouse was quiet, but the air between them felt less tense. Eva clutched her backpack tightly, her eyes darting between the skyscrapers that towered over the streets below. When they pulled into the underground garage, she hesitated before stepping out of the car, her gaze fixed on the polished marble floors and sleek metal fixtures. "This is where you live?" she asked, her tone incredulous. James nodded, leading her toward the elevator. "It's not as big as it looks." Eva raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. When the elevator doors opened to reveal his penthouse, her breath hitched. The space was expansive, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. The furniture was sleek and modern, every surface immaculate. Eva stepped inside hesitantly, her sneakers squeaking against the polished hardwood floor. She turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. "It's really clean," she said finally, her voice laced with unease. James chuckled. "I have someone who helps with that." She nodded but didn't look convinced. She clutched her backpack tighter, her small frame almost disappearing in the vastness of the space. "I'll show you to your room," James said, gesturing for her to follow him down a hallway. He opened the door to a guest room, revealing a large bed with crisp white sheets, a dresser, and a window overlooking the city. Eva stood in the doorway, her eyes wide. "This is my room? For now," James said. "Make yourself comfortable." She stepped inside, setting her backpack on the bed. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the unfamiliar surroundings. Then she turned to James, her expression unreadable. "Why are you doing this?" James hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain the pull he felt, the sense of responsibility that had taken root since the moment she approached him in the restaurant. "Because you need someone right now," he said simply, "and I can help." Eva didn't reply, but the guarded look in her eyes softened slightly. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her knees. "I'll leave you to get settled," James said, stepping back into the hallway. "If you need anything, my room's just down the hall." Eva nodded, but her gaze was distant, as if she were already lost in her thoughts. That night, James lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day played over and over in his mind, the desperation in Eva's voice, the sterile smell of the hospital, the hollow look in her eyes. He had spent his life avoiding entanglements, keeping people at arm's length. But now, he found himself responsible for a 10-year-old girl who had no one else. A soft knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. He sat up, surprised, and called out, "Come in." The door creaked open, and Eva stepped inside, clutching the stuffed animal she had brought from her apartment. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I couldn't sleep," she said quietly. James gestured for her to come in. "What's on your mind?" Eva hesitated, then sat down on the edge of the bed, her stuffed animal clutched tightly to her chest. "What if my mom doesn't get better?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. James's throat tightened, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. "She's in the best place she can be right now," he said carefully. "The doctors are doing everything they can." Eva nodded, but her expression didn't change. "I'm scared." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's okay to be scared. But you're not alone in this. We'll get through it together." For a moment, Eva didn't respond. Then she nodded slowly, her small frame relaxing ever so slightly. "Okay." As she stood to leave, James stopped her. "Eva?" She turned back, her eyes questioning. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "Don't forget that." A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Good night, James." "Good night, Ava." As the door clicked shut behind her, James felt a strange sense of resolve. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The following days unfolded with an odd sense of routine. Ava settled into the penthouse, though she seemed perpetually wary, as if waiting for the moment it would all disappear. James adjusted his schedule, something he rarely did, to ensure he was around more often. He wasn't sure why, but he felt a growing need to make sure Ava knew she wasn't alone. On the third morning, James found Ava in the kitchen, staring at the fridge. She still wore the oversized sweatshirt she'd brought from her apartment, her hair slightly messy. She didn't notice him at first, too focused on a note stuck to the fridge with a magnet. "Something catch your eye?" James asked, breaking the silence. Ava jumped slightly, then turned to him. "You write grocery lists?" James smirked, following her gaze. The note was indeed a grocery list, neatly written and absurdly detailed, including things like organic almond milk and imported truffle oil. "I don't write it. My assistant does. I'm not much of a chef." "You don't cook?" Ava asked, raising an eyebrow. "Let's just say my talents lie elsewhere," James admitted. "But we could order something." "What do you like?" Ava shrugged, her usual guarded expression returning. "Anything's fine." James frowned, recognizing her default answer. "How about pancakes? I know a great place nearby." Her eyes lit up, just for a moment, before she quickly masked her excitement. "Okay, pancakes sound good." They ended up at a cozy diner a few blocks away, the kind with checkered floors and the smell of fresh coffee wafting through the air. Ava sat across from James in a red vinyl booth, her hands wrapped around a glass of orange juice. She was quiet at first, but as the pancakes arrived, stacked high and drowning in syrup, she began to open up. "My mom used to make pancakes," Ava said between bites. "Not like this, though. Ours were lumpy. She always burned the edges." James chuckled. "Burnt edges give them character." "Yeah," Ava said, her voice soft. She said the same thing. There was a pause, the kind that teetered between comfort and sadness. James hesitated before asking, "How is she with the doctors? Have they told you anything new?" Ava's fork paused midway to her mouth. "They said she's stable, but it's still bad. They don't know if she'll, you know." James nodded, unsure of what to say. He didn't want to offer false hope, but he couldn't bring himself to admit the reality either. "You've been really brave through all of this, Ava. I hope you know that." Her cheeks flushed, and she quickly looked down at her plate. "I don't feel brave," she mumbled. "Sometimes being brave just means showing up," James said. "And you've done that, for your mom and for yourself." She didn't respond, but her small smile was enough to let him know she appreciated the words. Later that afternoon, James received an unexpected call. It was from the hospital, a nurse updating him on Ava's mother. While her condition hadn't worsened, it hadn't improved significantly either. The words lingered in James's mind, heavy with implications. When he hung up, he found Ava sitting in the corner of the living room with a sketchpad in her lap. She was drawing, her movements quick and precise, but there was a tension in her posture. "Hey," he said, approaching cautiously. "Can I see what you're working on?" Ava hesitated before holding up the sketchpad. The drawing was of the city skyline, rough but remarkably detailed. James was struck by the accuracy, especially considering her age. "This is incredible," he said honestly. "You've got real talent." Ava shrugged. "It's just something I do to, you know, keep my mind busy." "You ever think about doing more with it? Maybe taking lessons or something?" She shook her head quickly. "I don't need lessons. It's just a hobby." James didn't push, sensing the defensiveness in her tone. Instead, he sat down beside her. "You're really good, though. If you ever want to explore it more, let me know. I'd be happy to help." Ava glanced at him, her expression softening. "Maybe. Thanks." That evening, James received another visitor, someone he hadn't expected. Margaret Lucas, a social worker assigned to Ava's case, arrived at the penthouse unannounced. James opened the door to find her standing there, clipboard in hand and an expression that was equal parts professional and skeptical. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her tone polite but firm. I'm Margaret Lucas, the caseworker assigned to Ava. James stepped aside to let her in. Of course. Please, come in. Margaret's eyes swept over the penthouse, taking in the clean lines and luxurious furnishings. You've taken Ava into your home? For now, James replied, until her mother recovers. Margaret nodded, her pen hovering over her clipboard. And you're aware of the responsibilities involved in caring for a minor? Yes, James said firmly. I may not have planned for this, but I'm doing my best to make sure she's safe and comfortable. Margaret studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp. I appreciate that, Mr. Caldwell, but we need to ensure Ava's long-term stability. Her mother's recovery is uncertain, and if her condition worsens, Ava could be placed into foster care. The words hit James like a punch to the gut. Foster care, he repeated, his voice rising slightly. She's already been through enough. She doesn't need to be uprooted again. Margaret sighed. I understand your concern, but the system is in place for a reason. Unless you're willing to pursue legal guardianship or adoption, her placement may be unavoidable. James glanced toward the hallway, where Ava's room was. The thought of her being taken away, placed with strangers, felt wrong on every level. What would that process look like? He asked carefully. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Are you saying you're considering it? I'm saying I want to know my options. James replied, his tone firm. Margaret nodded. It would involve a home evaluation, interviews, and, of course, court approval. It's not a quick or easy process. I don't care how difficult it is. James said, if it's what's best for Ava, I'll do it. Margaret studied him for a long moment before nodding. All right, I'll make note of your intentions. In the meantime, I'll need to speak with Ava. James hesitated, then gestured toward the hallway. She's in her room. Margaret thanked him and disappeared down the hall. James sank onto the couch, his mind racing. He hadn't planned for this, for any of it, but now he couldn't imagine walking away. When Margaret finally left, Ava approached James cautiously. What did she say? James took a deep breath. She said they're keeping an eye on things. And, she mentioned that if your mom doesn't get better, they might have to find another place for you. Ava's face fell, her eyes wide with fear. You mean foster care? James nodded reluctantly. But I'm not going to let that happen. She looked at him, her expression a mix of hope and uncertainty. You promise? James met her gaze, his voice steady. I promise. Whatever it takes. Ava, you're not going anywhere. For the first time, she reached out, placing her small hand on his arm. Thank you. The gesture was simple but profound. In that moment, James realized just how much Ava had come to mean to him, and how far he was willing to go to protect her. James woke up early the next morning, a sense of determination settling over him. The conversation with Margaret weighed heavily on his mind, but it had crystallized one thing: he couldn't let Ava be taken away. Whatever it took, court hearings, evaluations, or filling out endless paperwork, he would do it. He found Ava in the kitchen, her sketchpad open on the counter, a half-eaten piece of toast on a plate beside her. She didn't notice him at first, engrossed in a new drawing. This one was different from the cityscapes she'd sketched before. It showed a small apartment with a cracked window, a single figure sitting on the floor. Is that your apartment? James asked softly, not wanting to startle her. Ava looked up, her eyes flickering with surprise before nodding. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to remember it, before everything changed. James pulled out a chair and sat across from her. You know, change isn't always bad. Ava shrugged, her pencil moving absently across the page. It feels bad. I don't even know what's going to happen now. James leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. I talked to Margaret, the social worker. She told me about the process for keeping you here, with me. Ava's hand froze mid-stroke, her eyes narrowing. What do you mean? I mean, James said carefully, if something happens to your mom, I want you to know you'll have a home here, with me. Ava blinked, her expression shifting from suspicion to something softer, almost vulnerable. You really mean that? James nodded. I do, but it's going to take some time and effort to make it official. There's a lot of paperwork and meetings involved. Ava set down her pencil. her small hands curling into fists. "I don't want to go to some foster home," she said quietly. "I've heard stories, bad ones." "You won't have to," James said firmly. "I won't let that happen." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of trust. "Okay," she said softly. "Thank you." That afternoon, James began the daunting process of preparing for custody. He scheduled a meeting with his lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Helen Barrett who had handled his business contracts for years. When he explained the situation, she raised an eyebrow but nodded. "It's not going to be easy," Helen said, flipping through her notepad. "The court will want to see evidence that you're capable of providing a stable, nurturing environment. They'll look at everything, your financials, your schedule, your home life." James frowned. "I can provide for her financially, and I've adjusted my schedule to be more flexible. What else do they need?" Helen gave him a pointed look. "They'll want to see that you're emotionally invested, too. This isn't just about money, James. It's about proving you can care for her in every way." He nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "What's the first step?" "We'll file for temporary guardianship," Helen said. "It'll give you time to build your case for permanent custody. In the meantime, you should focus on showing Ava that she's a priority, not just to you, but to everyone involved." James left the meeting feeling both determined and overwhelmed. He wasn't used to dealing with emotions or relationships. His world had always been one of numbers and logic. But this wasn't about him. It was about Ava. Back at the penthouse, James found Ava sitting at the piano in the corner of the living room. She was pressing random keys, a soft melody beginning to emerge. He hadn't even known she could play. "You play the piano?" he asked, walking over. Ava jumped slightly, her hands pulling away from the keys. "Not really. My mom used to sing, though. She'd make up songs, and I'd try to play them." James sat down on the bench beside her, feeling out of place but intrigued. "Can you play one of them?" Ava hesitated, her fingers hovering above the keys. "It's not very good," she said quietly. "I'd still like to hear it," James said, his tone encouraging. Slowly, Ava began to play. The melody was simple but haunting, each note carrying a weight that seemed far too heavy for a child. James watched her, struck by the concentration on her face, the way her small hands moved over the keys with surprising confidence. When she finished, the last note lingering in the air, she glanced at him nervously. "What do you think?" "I think it's beautiful," James said honestly. "You've got real talent." Ava blushed, looking down at the keys. "It's just something I do. It helps me not think about stuff." James nodded, understanding. "You know, if you're interested, I could find someone to teach you. A proper music teacher." Ava's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Really?" "Of course," James said. "You're already good. Imagine how much better you could be with some lessons." A small smile tugged at her lips, the first genuine one he'd seen in days. "I think I'd like that." Over the next week, life at the penthouse began to feel less temporary. James found himself adapting to Ava's presence in ways he hadn't expected. He adjusted his schedule further, working from home more often so he could be there for her. He even started learning how to cook, though Ava's teasing critiques of his first few attempts kept him humble. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table eating a slightly overcooked lasagna, Ava looked up at him. "You're really trying, huh?" James chuckled. "Is it that obvious?" "Yeah," she said, grinning. "But it's kind of nice." Her words caught him off guard, a warmth spreading through his chest. "Well, I guess you're worth it." Ava blushed, quickly shoving a forkful of lasagna into her mouth to avoid responding. Despite the growing bond between them, the shadow of Ava's mother's condition loomed. James called the hospital every day for updates. But the news was always the same, stable but critical. It wasn't the progress he'd hoped for. One night, as he sat in his study reviewing custody paperwork, Ava appeared in the doorway. She was clutching the stuffed animal she always slept with, her eyes wide and anxious. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly. James set down the papers and gestured for her to come in. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated before sitting on the edge of his desk chair. "Do you think my mom's going to get better?" James's throat tightened. He hated lying, But he also didn't want to crush her hope. The doctors are doing everything they can, he said carefully. And she's strong, just like you. Ava nodded, but her expression didn't change. I miss her. James reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. I know, and it's okay to feel that way. For a moment, Ava didn't respond. Then she leaned into him, her small frame trembling slightly. Thanks, James. He wrapped his arm around her, feeling a strange but comforting sense of purpose. For the first time, he realized just how much Ava had come to mean to him, and how far he was willing to go to make sure she felt safe. The day of the custody hearing arrived with an air of tension that James couldn't shake. He had spent weeks preparing, assembling documents, attending interviews, and meeting with the social worker to ensure every detail of his case was airtight. Yet, as he sat outside the courtroom with Ava beside him, he felt a pang of doubt. What if it wasn't enough? Ava was quiet, her small hands folded in her lap. She wore a simple dress they had picked out together, her hair neatly braided. Despite her calm demeanor, James could see the worry in her eyes. You okay? He asked softly. Ava nodded but didn't look up. What if they don't let me stay? James reached out, gently placing a hand over hers. We've done everything we can. And no matter what happens, I'm not giving up on you. She finally looked at him, her wide eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. Promise? Promise, he said firmly. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the warmth James had worked so hard to create for Ava. The polished wood, high ceilings, and somber atmosphere were designed to intimidate. And they succeeded. James sat beside his lawyer, Helen, who exuded her usual calm confidence. Across the room sat Margaret Lucas, the social worker, and the state-appointed attorney tasked with arguing for Ava's placement in foster care. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, called the hearing to order. We're here today to determine the temporary custody arrangement for Ava Carter. Mr. Caldwell, you've petitioned for guardianship. Please present your case. Helen rose, delivering a concise and compelling argument. She outlined James's ability to provide Ava with a stable home, his financial means, and the adjustments he had made to prioritize her well-being. She also highlighted the bond that had formed between them, calling it a testament to James's commitment to Ava's happiness and security. When it was time for the opposing counsel to speak, they focused on James's lack of experience with children. They questioned his ability to meet Ava's emotional needs, citing his demanding career and previously solitary lifestyle. James expected the scrutiny, but it still stung. He had spent his life mastering control. Yet here he was, his capabilities as a guardian being dissected in a room full of strangers. The most nerve-wracking moment came when Ava was called to the stand. James's heart clenched as she walked to the front of the courtroom, her small frame dwarfed by the imposing chair. The judge leaned forward, her tone softening. Ava, I know this must be a little scary, but I just want to hear from you. Can you tell us how you've been doing with Mr. Caldwell? Ava glanced at James, then back at the judge. She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the chair. He's been really good to me, she said, her voice trembling slightly. When my mom got sick, I didn't know what to do. Everyone else ignored me, but he listened. He helped. The judge nodded. And do you feel safe with him? Yes, Ava said firmly. He takes care of me. He makes sure I have everything I need. But more than that, he makes me feel like I'm not alone anymore. James felt a lump rise in his throat, the weight of her words hitting him harder than he expected. Thank you, Ava, the judge said kindly. You can take your seat. As Ava returned to her spot beside James, he gave her a small smile. She hesitated for a moment before slipping her hand into his, squeezing it tightly. After hours of arguments and testimony, the judge called for a brief recess before delivering her decision. James and Ava waited in silence, the tension between them almost unbearable. When the judge returned, the room fell silent. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at James. Mr. Caldwell, this court recognizes the significant effort you've made to provide Ava with a stable and loving environment. While you lack traditional parenting experience, it is clear that your commitment to her well-being is genuine and profound. James held his breath as she continued. Therefore, I am granting you temporary custody of Ava Carter, with a review in 6 months to assess the arrangement's progress. Relief washed over James like a tidal wave. He turned to Ava, whose face lit up with a mixture of joy and disbelief. We did it, he whispered. Ava threw her arms around him, holding on tightly. For the first time, James allowed himself to believe that everything would be okay. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments. With the court's decision behind them, James focused on creating a sense of normalcy for Ava. He enrolled her in a nearby school, found her a music teacher, and even transformed one of the spare rooms into an art studio where she could draw and paint to her heart's content. Ava blossomed in ways James hadn't anticipated. She excelled in her music lessons, her compositions growing more confident and intricate. Her drawings became more vibrant, each one telling a story of hope and resilience. But it wasn't just Ava who changed. James found himself opening up in ways he never thought possible. He traded late nights in the office for family dinners, business meetings for school recitals. Slowly but surely, he began to see his life through Ava's eyes. And it was more fulfilling than he could have imagined. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Ava looked up at James. "Do you think my mom would be proud of me?" James's chest tightened. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I think she'd be more than proud. She'd be amazed at how strong you are." Ava nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I miss her. I know," James said softly. "And that's okay. Missing her means she'll always be with you." Ava leaned against him, her small frame warm and steady. "Thank you, James, for everything." "You don't have to thank me," he said, wrapping an arm around her. "You're family now, and family takes care of each other." The 6-month review came and went, with the judge commending the progress James and Ava had made together. By the time the adoption papers were finalized, it felt more like a formality than a decision. They had already become a family in every way that mattered. On the day of the adoption ceremony, they celebrated with a small gathering at the penthouse. Margaret Lucas even stopped by, offering a rare smile as she congratulated them. That evening, as James and Ava sat on the balcony watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Ava turned to him. "Do you think we'll always be like this?" James smiled, pulling her close. "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know one thing." "What's that?" Ava asked. "No matter what happens, you'll never be alone again." Ava smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. For the first time in a long time, both of them felt truly at peace. And for James, the realization hit him with a quiet certainty. This was what it meant to truly live.